So today I want to talk about food, not in a vague, generalized way, not with projections about what might happen in 20 years if things continue on their current trajectory. I want to talk about food right now, about what the current numbers actually show about the state of global food supply relative to global food demand. And I want to explain why those numbers, read together, tell a story that is significantly more alarming than what mainstream commentary is communicating to ordinary people. Let me start with the number that should be the headline of every major financial publication, but almost never is: global grain stocks. The world's grain reserves, the stockpiles of wheat, corn, rice, and soybeans that buffer production shortfalls and price volatility, have been declining as a share of annual consumption for years. The stocks-to-use ratio, which measures how many months of consumption are covered by existing reserves, has been trending downward across most major grain categories. For wheat, one of the two most critical staple crops feeding the global population, the global stocks-to-use ratio has at various recent points fallen to levels last seen in the early 2000s before the food price crisis of 2007 to 2008. That crisis, which produced food riots in over 30 countries and contributed to political instability across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, was triggered by a stocks-to-use ratio that by today's standards does not look particularly alarming. What that tells you is that the buffer between normal and crisis in the global food system is thinner than most people understand, and it is getting thinner. But the reserves number is just the first layer of the story. Because to understand why global food security is more fragile than the official narrative suggests, you need to understand the structural inputs that produce the food in the first place. And those inputs are all under simultaneous pressure in ways that have never occurred together before in the history of modern industrial agriculture. And if you are finding this analysis useful, please subscribe. I cover these structural, economic, and resource realities every week because understanding them is essential for anyone trying to make sense of why food prices keep rising and what the trajectory looks like from here. The first structural input under pressure is fertilizer. Modern industrial agriculture is extraordinarily dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which is produced from natural gas through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. Without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the world could not feed anywhere near its current population. The yield increases that allowed global food production to keep pace with population growth over the past century were achieved largely through the application of synthetic fertilizers. And the production of those fertilizers is directly tied to the price and availability of natural gas. When natural gas prices spike, fertilizer prices spike. When fertilizer prices spike, farmers apply less of it, or they cannot afford to apply it at all. And when farmers apply less fertilizer, yields fall. The conflict in Ukraine directly disrupted global fertilizer supply chains because Russia and Belarus together account for a substantial share of global potash and nitrogen fertilizer exports. When the conflict began and Western sanctions were imposed, fertilizer prices spiked to levels not seen in decades. Farmers in Europe, South Asia, and Africa faced fertilizer costs that made normal application rates economically unviable. Some reduced their application. Some switched to lower yield varieties. Some left land fallow that would otherwise have been planted. The resulting yield reductions were measured in the harvest data of 2022 and 2023. The Middle East conflict is raising natural gas prices through its disruption of Gulf energy supply chains. Every disruption to the energy system is simultaneously a disruption to the food system through the fertilizer transmission mechanism. And this is not a relationship that resolves when the conflicts end. The infrastructure for fertilizer production, the trade routes, the supply contracts, and the price expectations of farmers planning their next planting season are all affected by geopolitical disruption in ways that persist long after the immediate military activity subsides. This connection between geopolitical conflict, energy prices, fertilizer availability, and food production is not theoretical. It is a direct arithmetic relationship that plays out in every planting season across every agricultural region on Earth. The second structural input under pressure is energy itself. Modern food production is energy intensive at every stage. Tractors run on diesel. Irrigation pumps run on electricity or diesel. Food processing facilities run on electricity. Refrigeration runs on electricity. Logistics, the trucks and ships and trains that move food from where it is produced to where it is consumed, run on diesel. A 20% increase in energy costs translates into a significant increase in food production and delivery costs at every stage of the supply chain. And because food is a necessity, not a luxury, producers cannot simply stop producing when costs rise. They pass those costs through to consumers. This is why energy price shocks and food price inflation are so reliably correlated. They are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon transmitted through the agricultural supply chain. The third structural input under pressure is arable land. The amount of arable land available for food production globally is not expanding fast enough to keep pace with demand. In many regions, it is contracting. Urbanization is converting agricultural land to residential and commercial use at significant rates in Asia, in Africa, and in South America. Soil degradation, caused by decades of intensive monoculture farming with heavy chemical inputs, is reducing the productivity of existing agricultural land in ways that are not fully captured in the yield statistics. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has estimated that a significant share of the world's agricultural soils have been degraded to some degree. Degraded soil requires more inputs, more fertilizer, more water, more chemical treatment to produce the same yields, which means the cost of food production is rising even on land that remains technically in production. If you have not subscribed yet, please do that now. The structural analysis I am building here connects directly to the food prices you pay today and the trajectory of those prices over the coming years. The fourth structural input under pressure is climate volatility. I want to be careful here because this is an area where the evidence is clear, but the communication is often distorted in both directions. What the agricultural data shows is not that climate change will eventually reduce food production at some point in the future. What it shows is that weather pattern volatility, the increasing frequency and severity of droughts, floods, heat waves, and late frosts is already reducing agricultural predictability and, in many regions, agricultural yields. The 2022 heat wave in Europe reduced wheat yields across France, Spain, and other major producing countries significantly. Pakistan's catastrophic flooding in 2022 destroyed a large share of that nation's cotton and rice crops. Australia's cyclical droughts have produced dramatic swings in wheat production that contribute to global price volatility. Each of these events individually can be described as weather. The pattern of their increasing frequency and severity is something different. It is a structural increase in agricultural risk that is not yet fully priced into global food supply planning. The fifth factor is geopolitical weaponization of food supply. The Russia-Ukraine conflict removed from the global market two of the world's largest grain exporters simultaneously. Ukraine and Russia together accounted for approximately 30% of global wheat exports before the conflict. Russia has periodically restricted or threatened to restrict its grain and fertilizer exports as a geopolitical tool. India, the world's largest rice exporter, imposed rice export bans in 2023 to protect its domestic supply. Indonesia restricted palm oil exports. Multiple nations have in recent years imposed food export restrictions that prioritized domestic supply at the expense of global market stability. This trend toward food nationalism, toward treating food production as a strategic resource to be hoarded rather than traded freely, is a structural shift in the global food architecture that makes the system less resilient to production shortfalls. When a drought hits a major producing region, the global system used to absorb the shock through trade, other producers would fill the gap. Prices would spike temporarily, then normalize as supply adjusted. This buffering mechanism, which is the fundamental justification for the global free trade architecture in agricultural commodities, depends on all the major producers participating in the open market simultaneously, When major producers are restricting exports and building domestic reserves, the buffering mechanism breaks down. The shock is no longer distributed across the global market. It concentrates in the import-dependent nations that cannot fill the gap from domestic production. Those nations are disproportionately in the developing world. Their populations spend a far higher share of income on food than populations in wealthy nations. And when the food price shock hits, the consequences are not just financial inconvenience. They are hunger, malnutrition, and the political conditions that generate the conflict, instability, and refugee flows that eventually affect every nation connected to the global economy. The weaponization of food exports is not a new phenomenon historically, but the scale at which it is now occurring, with multiple major exporters simultaneously restricting trade for domestic political reasons, represents a structural shift in the reliability of the global food trade system that has not been adequately priced into global food security planning. Now, let me connect all of these structural pressures to the arithmetic of where the global food system actually stands. Global population is approximately 8.1 billion people. It is projected to reach approximately 9.7 billion by 2050. Feeding that population at current average caloric intake levels requires continuous growth in agricultural output. That growth is being delivered under conditions of declining water availability, increasing fertilizer costs, degrading soil quality, rising energy costs, growing climate volatility, and increasing geopolitical restrictions on food trade. Every one of those conditions is a headwind against the production growth required to feed a growing global population. And they are all intensifying simultaneously rather than sequentially. The standard response to concerns about food security has always been technological optimism. New seed varieties, better irrigation techniques, precision agriculture, vertical farming. These innovations are real and they matter, but the rate at which technology can increase yields is constrained by fundamental biology and physics in ways that the rate of structural input deterioration is not. You cannot breed a crop variety that grows without water. You cannot engineer soil that does not need nutrients. You cannot eliminate the energy cost of mechanized agriculture. The world is not running out of food tomorrow. The trajectory is not toward imminent mass famine in wealthy nations. But the trajectory of the structural inputs to food production is not a trajectory toward the comfort and abundance that the post-war agricultural revolution delivered. It is a trajectory toward tighter margins, structurally higher prices that permanently reduce household purchasing power, and a global food system with less resilience against the production shocks that will arrive with increasing frequency. The world you grew up in, where food was reliably cheap, where famines were becoming less frequent, where the Green Revolution had solved the arithmetic of feeding humanity, was built on specific structural conditions that are now under pressure: cheap energy, abundant fresh water, stable climate patterns, open global trade in agricultural commodities. Those conditions made feeding 8 billion people possible. They are all being challenged simultaneously. And the numbers are already showing you the early consequences in every grocery receipt. Subscribe for more analysis of these structural realities explained clearly and plainly. And tell me in the comments, do you think the world is doing enough to address these structural food system pressures? See you next time.